Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Knitpicks.com has been serving the knitting community for over 20 years and believes knitting is for everyone, which is why they work hard to make knitting accessible, affordable, and approachable. Knitpicks responsibly sources its fiber to create an extensive selection of affordable yarns like High Desert from Shaniko Wool Company. Are you looking for an ethical, eco-friendly yarn to try? Look no further than Knitpicks Eco Yarn line. Need needles? Knitpicks makes a selection for knitters right at their Vancouver, Washington headquarters. Knitpicks.com, a place for every knitter. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Irene Waggener is an independent researcher whose work focuses on knitting and spinning. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, when many people think about knitting traditions, they might think about Shetland lace shawls or Scandinavian sweaters or even like Peruvian chuyos. But you have gone and explored knitting traditions in places that most people would never even think of as having knitting traditions. Can you tell me a little bit about where you've gone and what you've seen?
Sure. So let's see if I can remember my dates. In 2018, I moved to Morocco. And, when I went there, I did not go there thinking that I was going to run into a specific knitting tradition. But I knew that, textile arts were very alive and present in this country. And so, when you go to Morocco, you see the rugs and all the beautiful textiles and woven kind of goods. But I guess it was my first fall there. My husband and we decided to go on a hike in the High Atlas Mountains. And we were staying in the Ait Bougmez Valley at this very beautiful eco-lodge called Tuda Eco Lodge. And we went on the hike, and our hike sort of ended in the village below Tuda Eco Lodge. And there is a little museum that the village has put together to collect all of the old style tools and things that people used to use before more modern type tools came to the valley. And in one of the rooms, one of the rooms was dedicated to textiles and the rugs and the sort of the woven cloth people would make for jalabas, which are the long robes with the hoods that people wear in Morocco. But in the corner of this room, I noticed this black and white striped pair of something. It was just like this black and white striped garment that was sort of hanging in the corner. And so I went closer to have a look, and it turned out that it was a pair of knitted pants. And I was like, well, first of all, knitted pants. I had never seen knitted pants anywhere before. And then on top of that, it had this super interesting like zigzag pattern going up the leg. And it just sort of sparked all these questions in my mind. I mean, as a knitter, I was super intrigued and interested in seeing knitted garments in Morocco. And so, of course, I had to ask myself, like, who made these pants? How did they make them? Why did they make them? All these things. And so that's sort of what started my journey with knitting in Morocco. It was my effort to try and find the answers to those questions that sort of opened up this whole new world to me, a new world for me. And that's sort of how I got started.
Wow. And I've heard you refer to yourself as an independent researcher. What does that mean?
So I am not associated with an academic institution, but I do take researching my work very seriously. And I have a background in cultural anthropology. I have a BA in cultural anthropology and a master's degree in education. And so I try to, bring as high a level of work as I can to the research that I do.
And when you say research, what kind of research were you doing? Are you field research, academic, library research? How are you learning about these things?
Sure. I think one of the things I enjoy the most about working with knitted textiles is that it's very, very multidisciplinary. Of course, with my background in cultural anthropology, I think I'm definitely drawing on that experience that I have and that education that I have. A good part of my work was ethnographic. I was working directly with people, interviewing them, employing different kinds of ethnographic methodologies to, learn about the people who do this type of knitting, about the environment in which they're living, the context in which this knitting exists. But, I think it's very important to also look into the history of these things, like what is the history of knitting in this area? And so, of course, that requires more historical methodologies. And then there's also, there's a lot of looking at ancient manuscripts to get a sense for, what was the context of this region like in the time period in which these older knitted artifacts might have been made. There is, of course, the archaeological evidence. So, there's a lot of looking at objects in museums, those kinds of things. And then there's also, alongside sort of looking at things from an archaeological perspective, there's also applying my own craft knowledge to this and, looking at objects from my perspective as a knitter and what I know about the way knit fabric works and how it's made and also taking what I've learned from the knitters that I was working with in the High Atlas and sort of using that to help me inform how I'm looking at these more historical pieces. And then surprisingly, there's even things, I even drew a bit on linguistics and sort of looking at, what are the words that people are using to describe these objects? Where might these words have come from? Why would they have used them? Why is there a difference in the way people described the word that is used for socks in Morocco is not the same word that's used for socks in Egypt or the rest of the Arabic-speaking world. Why is that? So I sort of rely on all these different perspectives to bring my research to life and to bring this knitting tradition to life.
So take me back to this museum. You found this pair of amazing striped knitted pants in the corner. And where in this realm of, after you asked yourself, how did these get here? Who made these? Tell me what came next.
What came next? That is a good question. So it was just a lot of talking to people, specifically artisans, and just talking to people so I guess the very first thing was I talked to the people in Aitboukmez who were there, who were working with the hotel, do you know people who still make these kinds of pants? And at that time, the answer was no, nobody really makes these anymore. And so, I kind of hit a dead end there, but I did end up contacting an organization called the ANU, which is a super cool organization. And through my conversations with the sort of the founder and director of one of the founders and directors of the organization, I was able to meet some artisans in the High Atlas. And the person I had spoken with, he had suggested that I actually look in the Aitbouli Valley, which is a neighboring valley to Aitboukmez, because the road had been paved. It had taken a long time for the road to be paved into this valley. And so they were kind of cut off from the rest of Morocco for a longer period of time, and which meant that they didn't have access to as many sort of modern mass-produced goods as people in the Aitboukmez Valley had access to. And so he had suggested to me that maybe possibly in this valley, I might still be able to find people who remember how to knit these types of pants. And so he put me in contact with a cooperative there called Cooperative Ibilo. And I met the cooperative's founder, Nora Edelimi, who's a wonderful young woman with lots of energy and a huge vision for her community. And she essentially she and her family and then the village sort of took me under their wing. And that's sort of how I found my contacts was through Nora, because she had founded this cooperative in her village as a way to provide job opportunities for the women in her village. It was, and I think things are changing now, but it is for the most part difficult for women to get outside of the valley to find work. And there aren't a lot of economic opportunities for them in the valley, but their textile crafts are one way that they can earn money for themselves and their families. And so she sort of organized women in her village to weave pile carpets, the kind of pile carpets that, are very popular all over the world today. And yeah, so it was through them that I met their husbands and fathers and uncles who are actually the knitters in this region of Morocco.
Oh. And now a word from our sponsors. Sustainability and regenerative ranching have been a way of life for the ranches of Shaniko Wool Company for decades. They're the first farm group in the U.S. to achieve certification to the rigorous International Responsible Wool Standard and Nativa Regenerative. Shaniko ranches raise merino Rambouillet sheep in the western U.S., delivering a fully traceable wool supply that gives back to the earth and its ecosystems. To learn more and discover Shaniko's yarn partners, visit shanicowoolcompany.com. Knitters know Manos del Uruguay for their yarn's rich tonal colors, but the story of women's empowerment and community benefit enriches every skein. Discover 17 bases from lace-weight to super bulky, made and dyed at artisan-owned cooperatives in Uruguay. Ask for Manos at your local retailer or visit fairmountfibers.com. And now back to the show. And so did you show up with your needles and how how did you learn more about the knitting?
Sure, I did. So I went there and I was there to kind of learn about the spinning, about the wool and the spinning in that area, because they were interested in, maybe possibly marketing their yarn to the international community. But they wanted someone to kind of give them an idea of what international market expectations might be, like what might a weaver or a knitter in the United States expect from a skein of yarn that they've bought from Morocco, that sort of thing. And so when I first went there, I went there to kind of talk with them about that. And I did not know that there were any knitters in the village at that time. And so I originally went there with the intent to, just kind of like talk to them about what is it that Americans are looking for in a skein of yarn. But, as I would visit these women in their homes and talk with them, I would also just, kind of mention like, hey, I'm also a knitter. Do you know anybody here who knits? And it took me a couple of tries to kind of get the point across as to what I was saying. They brought out many beautiful textiles that were not knitted. But I was working, so I guess just to kind of give some context, I was working in Darija, which is the Moroccan dialect of Arabic. And Nora was translating for me from Darija into Tashalhit, which is the Amazigh language or the Berber language that is spoken in this area. And then the women would talk to her in Tashalhit, and then she would translate that into Darija for me. So I was kind of having a little bit of a hard time explaining what I wanted in this, but I was at this one woman's house and her son was there kind of listening to us talking about these things. And he was like, you know what? I think I know what you're talking about. And so he like ran from the room and he comes back like maybe 5 minutes later and he has this really grotty old pair of socks that like clearly somebody has, they were very well worn and very well loved. And they had holes in them and like stains and all kinds of things. And his mom looked at him. She was horrified, kind of like, why are you bringing our dirty laundry in here? And he was like, is this what you're talking about? And I think I almost screamed. I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And the mom was super taken aback and was just kind of like, what? Really? Like, this is what you want to look at? And so that's kind of how I learned that it's the men in the village who do all of the knitting. And unfortunately, at that time, they weren't in the village. They were all out with their sheep up at the mountains. And so it was sort of like, okay, you're going to have to come back when they're back in the village if you want to talk to them about this. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
What is the yarn like?
The yarn it's amazing. So the sheep in the High Atlas, it's a landrace breed that is specific to the High Atlas Mountains. And it's kind of a medium staple to longish staple, I would say, like maybe about medium to long staple, and a very low grease. It's a low grease wool, and it has like a slight wave to it, but not necessarily a lot of crimpiness to it. But in my opinion, it's lovely to spin with. In the High Atlas, they use supported spindles for the most part, and it's just, I think it's a really great wool to start with as a beginner. And, but I think you could compare it to a Navajo churro type wool or a Tunis. In fact, I think all of those sheep might in some ways be related. So yeah, or the other one that I think is similar in the United States to sort of what High Atlas wool feels like is the Gulf Coast Gulf
Oh,
Coast
Gulf Coast
native.
native.
Yeah, that's another one
Hmm.
that has kind of a similar type of wool.
So when I think about Morocco, I typically think about the beautiful areas along the ocean and hot and you mentioned carpets, and so certainly think about weaving. Can you tell me a little bit about what the High Atlas is like?
Sure.
Because I can't imagine somebody needing knitted socks in Casablanca, for example.
Yeah. So Morocco is interesting. It's actually, the climate is very similar to California, I think. Yeah, it is very similar to California. And I mean, even on the coastal areas, it can get quite chilly. The weather's, I mean, in the summertime, of course, the weather's pleasant, but in the wintertime, it can get cold and wet. And then, of course, you have the Atlas Mountains. And so the mountains are quite tall. It starts snowing up there quite early. In fact, my friend Nora Adelimi, the one who was sort of my main contact in the High Atlas, she recently posted a video on her Instagram account of snow in Timloukine. So it's like wet, like early November, and they've already had, I think this might actually be their second snowfall up there. So, of course, with climate change, weather is changing. In the past, the Aitbouli Valley actually, their passes, like the passes that would have led into their valley, like the roads and things that they would have used, would actually get blocked by snow for 6 months out of the year. And so for 6 months out of the year, they were cut off from anything outside of their valley area. And that is actually one of the reasons why they knit these pants. So the knit pants that I had seen at the museum in the Ait Boukmez Valley, or in the past, they were worn by men. And they would wear them in the wintertime for different kinds of activities, one of them being shoveling snow off of their roofs because they live in these rammed earth homes that are reminiscent of like the Pueblo style homes that you would see in the American Southwest. So they have these flat roofs, and because it's rammed earth, like they're quite heavy already. You have these timber beams that sort of create the frame, and then you have earth piled on top of that. And so if you let the snow pile up on those roofs, they will eventually collapse. And so when the snow comes, the men, they go out periodically as the snow is falling, and they shovel the snow off of those roofs. And so those pants are vital in that kind of a situation. And they would also use them when they would go hunting. They used to have a lot of mouflon, which is a type of wild sheep that lived in the High Atlas. And they would sit in the snow and wait for these sheep to come by. And so they needed something that would keep them warm. And so these pants were also worn in that occasion. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the physical environment, it can be quite dry. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think like how to describe the scenery and stuff, but it's sort of like high desert in some ways. It's very similar to California. But yeah.
And I have seen a picture of those pants, or had seen a picture of those pants even before I saw your book, because Josephine Woltin, who is in Sweden, has knitted a pair of those pants and uses them to break ice. Wears them to break ice.
Yes. Josephine is amazing. I love her. The High Atlas pants that she made, they have a super cool story. And I think she shared that story with you on one of your earlier podcasts. But yeah, she does this. She goes and she bathes in her local, I think it's a lake that's near her house. And she goes every day, regardless of what the weather is like. And so she was in need of a warm pair of pants to put on afterwards in the wintertime. And so I think she used the wool from one particular sheep. It was 2 shearings, I think, from 2 different years. And so the color in her pants kind of changes over time with the sheep's, like the dark color wool. It's a little bit lighter, I think, in the later shearing. And so, yeah, she knit the pants using the pattern that I documented in the book that I wrote in collaboration with the shepherds or the knitters in the High Atlas. And it was really fun because I actually was able to meet up with her in Sweden one summer, and we both brought our High Atlas pants, and we met in a park in Malmö, Sweden. It was summertime, so it was a little bit warm to put them on, but we were like, we can't come here and bring our 2 pairs of High Atlas pants together and not put them on. And so, so that was a lot of fun, meeting her and getting to feel her pair of High Atlas pants and see the work that she did.
And these pants are not subtle. they are not they are not delicately patterned. They are bold.
They are very bold. And I think that's what's so fun about them, you know? They really make a statement and they're just so unique and they tell a really interesting story and of place and a particular culture and people. And I think it's a very special part of culture in the High Atlas that is important to remember and pass on.
So you had to have somebody help explain to you, because I'm trying to figure out how you learned how to make these pants. Because, like, did you sit with somebody who was knitting the whole pair, or did you have somebody explain it to you and say, kind of like this?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Yes. So I made numerous trips up to the High Atlas, and I would do exactly what I used to do with my own grandmother when she was teaching me how to knit. I sat there with the knitter and watched them and asked them questions. And we didn't go through the entire process of making pants because it does take a while. But, you know, the knitters that I worked with, Moa Ahansali and Moa Knight Tabatut, they sort of, you know, they would show me the important parts, like how to get started, right? Like how many stitches do you need to cast on? How would you figure that out? How would you get the leg going? And so they kind of got me to the point where, like, okay, I can make both of these legs. And so then I would go back to my home and I would finish making the legs. And then once I got to the part where I needed to connect them, I would go back to the High Atlas and I'd stay there again. And we would do some knitting sessions and they'd show me how to connect the legs and do, you know, like the crotch. And then how would you do the part for the waist and all these things. And so it was sort of a combination of sitting there and watching them knit, and then also having them kind of explain, like, what's the next step. And the knitters that I worked with, they're all elderly. I think Mua Ahansali is actually blind in one of his eyes. And so knitting it's difficult. You know, it's not something that they do very much anymore. Also, certainly because nobody in the village really wears these pants anymore. So I think I might confuse my dates. It's written in the book, but I think Mua Ahansali, he hadn't knit a pair of these pants since, like, the last pair he knit was like in 1975. So
Oh,
it was
wow.
quite a long time ago. And then on top of that, you know, they're busy men. They are still, you know, they have their farm fields that they have to take care of. They have to take care of their sheep. And so it was sort of, we would just sort of squeeze in knitting whenever they had a moment to sit with me and sort of show me these things. So I was kind of, you know, trying to navigate their schedules and also their ability level in terms of, you know, like their physical health and that sort of thing as well. So it happened over the course of many, many trips to the High Atlas.
It seems like the pants themselves would be a whole field of study, but you found a lot of other knitted items there, right? Can you tell me about some of the other, you mentioned socks.
Yeah. So they're one of my teachers, Hussein Mardi. He still knits socks on commission for other people in the village as well as for his family. And I do believe that you can probably find other sock knitters in villages in the High Atlas because it's still a product that people want. Almost across the board, everyone I spoke with up there said that handmade wool socks were the warmest in the wintertime. Like the acrylic mass-produced socks that you could get in the market just were no match for them. So they're still in high demand, I think, and people still want people to make them. So some people are still, like Hussein Mardi, they're still carrying on that tradition. But other items are not needed as much anymore, I suppose. Also, fashion changes, you know, like people want to wear different things. And so those bold striped pants, they just aren't in fashion anymore, I think. That's not to say that people don't still make them. You know, like I think you might be able to find a person here or there who might still make them. But honestly, I didn't see anybody wearing them when I was up there. It was sort of a novelty sort of thing at the time that I was there. But I do know that according to like travel accounts and ethnographic documentation from, you know, like the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century, and from museum objects, I do know that, you know, people were knitting leg warmers, they were knitting hats, they were knitting sweaters, they were knitting all kinds of things. But it's just, you know, again, fashion changes, needs change, and the knitting of these kinds of items sort of fell out of fashion, I guess, and people stopped doing it. So I did ask the knitters that I worked with. One of the cool things about sitting and working with people as they knit is that, you know, you have moments of silence, but it's also a great way to sort of reminisce about the past. And so it was, we might sit there in silence for like, a minute or two, but then inevitably something reminds somebody of something and they'll start talking about it. Or, I'll ask something about, oh, well, when you were learning to knit with your uncle, tell me about XYZ or something like that. And so, we ended up having a lot of conversations about what were the sorts of things that your uncle or your grandfather or your father, what was it that they knit? How do you think they would have made them? If the person I was working with at that time, if they hadn't actually made it themselves, I would ask them to kind of try to think about, well, how do you think the person who taught you to knit, how would they have done it? And so, yeah, I had a lot of really interesting conversations in that way.
So besides the socks, though, what else? Are there other items that are traditional to make?
Yeah, there's leg warmers, hats. They did make sweaters. What else? I think those were the main knitted items.
There was a belt, right?
There is a belt, but that is, okay, so that is something different. So part of my book, again, I wanted to sort of document the knitting tradition as it's practiced today. But I think a lot of researchers or people who have written about the history of knitting believe that knitting likely started in North Africa, probably Egypt, since that's where we get our oldest examples of knitting is from Egypt. And so my question to myself was, well, I'm over here on the western side of North Africa. Egypt is on the eastern side of North Africa. Are these knitting traditions in some way related? Can we connect the present tradition in Morocco to an older tradition that might have been practiced across North Africa, going all the way over to Egypt? And so in order to kind of answer this question for myself, I worked backwards with, what evidence do we have today? What evidence do we have that comes from, the early 20th century, or maybe possibly the late 19th century? And so in this way, I became aware of, how can I say this? I guess depictions of knitted items in ethnographic collections that go back to the early 1900s, and also items in museums that go back even further than that. And one of the key pieces of evidence for knitting in North Africa, I think, is this book written, or it's a pamphlet about the wool industry in Algeria. And it's mentioned in a number of knitting history books. Richard Rudd, in his History of Hand Knitting, talks about this pamphlet. It's called Le Travail de la Laine à Tlemcen, which is translated as essentially the wool industry in Tlemcen, which is a city in western Algeria, actually not too far from the Moroccan border. And in it, this pamphlet was written in 1913, I believe it was, so early 1900s. And in it, they actually have an entire chapter on knitting in Algeria. And they describe the different types of knitting that were being practiced in Tlemcen at that time that they were there. And they speculate about where, these practices might have come from. And they identify this sort of, this kind of indigenous knitting versus a newer knitting that, might have been introduced, in the colonial era, something like that. But in it, they mention these knitted belts. They mention two different types of knitted belts. One is a teka mahlula, which is sort of this open work kind of belt. In order to understand what they were talking about, I did a little bit of experimental archaeology and tried to make this belt based on the description that they provided. And I ended up with this very stretchy, very elastic material. So I really do think it was the precursor to elastic. And, they described that this would have been used to kind of hold up pants and that sort of thing. And it makes a lot of sense, especially if you're going to have a huge feast, you want something that's expandable. I was like, this is the perfect belt for Thanksgiving. So there's a teka mahlula, and then there was also the teka mankusa, which is a kind of more of a striped belt. And this one was made in a different way. So I believe that the teka mahlula, the one that's open in like a stretchy elastic band, I believe that one's knit flat, and it's sort of knit back and forth on your needles, and it creates sort of like open work structure on it with the type of stitches that they use. But the teka mankusa is actually knit as a tube, and it's sort of cinched together at the ends. And again, it's used to hold up pants. But the interesting thing about these belts is that there are examples of knitted tubular belts that were found in Egypt, found in Egypt. Exact provenance, I think, is kind of questionable sometimes with some of these Egyptian finds because they were found in the early 1900s or late 1800s, and sometimes provenance wasn't super clear. But these belts, they look exactly like the belts that are described by Bell and Ricard. Again, I did a little bit of experimental archaeology and I made the Teka Mancusa according to Bell and Ricard's descriptions. And it produces a belt that looks exactly like these ones that are coming from medieval Egypt.
So you've sort of collected these patterns in a book, but it's not just how these knitted items are made or were made historically. There's some elements that you've made to make these more applicable to probably your readers who are probably reading in English and probably have different sort of knitting expectations. Do you think of this as being a translation or original designs or ethnography? How do you think about that work?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. I guess when I describe it to people when they ask me about my work, I say it's sort of a mix of ethnography, travel writing, and historical writing. And it's just different, like I wanted to present the people who are participating in this tradition today. I wanted to present the context in which that tradition exists today. And then also how that connects to the past and how it connects to possibly, the history of knitting itself. There's not a whole lot of information about knitting's ancient roots in North Africa. And so I think we have a really interesting opportunity if this knitting tradition in the High Atlas is related to that historical knitting tradition. Like, this is a fantastic opportunity to learn directly from people that are practicing a craft that has been passed down for generations and generations, going all the way back to possibly those earliest knitting traditions in North Africa. But, again, a lot of these knitters, they are elderly and they're not passing on this knowledge as much as they would have done in the past. Again, life has changed. How people entertain themselves in their off time has changed. Certainly, like how people get their clothing has changed. All of these things, have conspired to sort of affect the state of this tradition today. And so I think that's why I was certainly interested in documenting the knitters of today. I was interested in documenting their knowledge. And, when I shared this idea with them, they also felt that it was important to do because from what as Hussein and Mua were telling me, like the younger generation, they're not as interested in learning this. And so, but this is an important skill that we should make sure is still available to future generations if they're interested in it. And so they felt that participating in this project was sort of a way to make sure that that knowledge can continue.
Are the techniques that are used by these knitters the same as what I would expect, what I would have learned from my grandmother in terms of not necessarily the very same increases, maybe the very same increases and decreases, but I mean, do they wrap their yarn around the needles in the same way? Is this sort of universal?
Yeah. So I know again, like the work that I did was very much a case study. And I think that there's still a lot of opportunity to go out there and canvas the High Atlas and talk to all of the knitters out there to really get a sense for how it's done. But the knitters that I worked with in Timloukine, they hold their working yarn in their right hand, which is how I was taught to knit as well. And they throw their yarn with their right hand. And in general, like the way that they knit looked very similar to the way that I was taught to knit by my grandmother. Their increases looked similar and decreases were similar. They do like a knit two together kind of thing. And it wasn't anything that was too different from what I was used to seeing. That being said, I realize all of us knitters, we have different ways of doing things. And so the way
Right.
I do it might be different from the way you do it. But yeah, in general, all three knitters that I worked with, they always had their working yarn in their right hand. And when they were working with two colors, they did not have one color in their left hand and one color in their right hand. So they weren't like throwing and picking at the same time. It was, you'd drop the color that you didn't want to work with and you'd use the color that you wanted to work with. And then you'd drop that color and use the other one, that sort of thing. And there wasn't necessarily this idea of, I'm going to forget the terminology, but like color dominance. There wasn't any like talk about that. It was just, you just pick up the yarn and use it. And again, though, I think this is very much an oral tradition. These patterns are not written down. And it's a lot of like try on as you go. If things don't work out, you just rip your work out to the point where it wasn't working and you try it again. There was a lot of just sort of like working from your gut and like, what do you think needs to happen next? And there was just, I think, I'm saying this because I came from, working with patterns and needing to knit a gauge swatch and, needing things to align perfectly in order for me to achieve the sweater that I see in the picture. And so when I was working with Mua and Hussein, it sort of brought me back to the style of knitting that my own grandmother did, which was much more like intuitive and kind of go with the flow. There's a lot of trying on as you go. That's probably the biggest thing, is just make sure you try it on and adjust as necessary.
So you mentioned that these men were initially out with their sheep when you came in. Is knitting very closely tied with shepherding for them?
Yes. Very much so. In fact, yeah, I think that's why it was something that the men did, because it's a very portable craft. In fact, I saw this a couple of times with Hussein when he was, coming to Nora's house to show me how to knit a heel or something like that. But when he would walk over to the house, he would store his knitting in his jalaba hood. And I don't know if you've seen, a Moroccan jalaba, but it's this long robe with this very, very large hood on the back. And the hood, it's so useful because the sun in the summertime can be quite hot and you need that hood to protect you from the sunshine. But it also protects you from the rain. It protects you from the cold. It protects you from everything. But it's also very large and it's an excellent pocket. It's an excellent carrying space because it's quite deep, actually. And so, yeah, he would just throw his knitting into his hood and then, he'd show up at the house and he'd take it out of the hood and he'd start knitting. And he told me that when they go out with the sheep, that's kind of what they would do. They would throw their knitting, especially if it's something small like socks or a hat, you can definitely fit it back in there. So that's one of the reasons why knitting was done by men. Whereas for the women, they tended to stay in the village at home. They wouldn't necessarily go far with the sheep. Women still do go out with the sheep too, like if it's in the village vicinity, but they're not going to take them up to the high pastures at the tops of the mountains. And so for the women, they focused on spinning the different types of yarn that were needed for weaving rugs or weaving cloth for clothing or weaving yarn for spinning yarn for knitting. And then they were also the ones working on the looms with the weaving.
Gotcha. And what's the name of this book that you wrote?
It's called Keepers of the Sheep, Knitting in Morocco's High Atlas and Beyond.
Cool. So Keepers of the Sheep, so the shepherding, that really carries on that whole tradition.
It does. And actually, I talk about it in the book, but there's also a deeper meaning to the name. So the story there's a couple of stories in Timloukine about why the Aitbouli Valley is called Aitbouli, but sort of the gist of the general idea of the story is that at some point in the past, there was some kind of a plague that hit the sheep and it killed off hundreds, if not thousands of sheep in the High Atlas. But the shepherds in the Aitbouli Valley, they were able to keep their sheep alive because of their shepherding skills and their knowledge of sheep. And it was from the population that survived in the Aitbouli Valley that other people in the High Atlas were able to sort of rebuild their herds again. And so, as it was explained to me, Aitbouli, it kind of means the keepers of the sheep, the people who know how to keep sheep. And so that's why I decided to name the book in honor of the valley where I did my work.
Oh, that's wonderful. So after you wrapped up your time in Morocco, you went off someplace else where there's knitting.
Yes, I did. I ended up in Yerevan, Armenia, which seems totally unrelated. But as I am doing my research for my second book, I'm finding that there's actually quite a lot of reason for the knitting in the Caucasus and the knitting in North Africa to be related. And so yeah, I'm busy working on diving into that question.
So tell me a little bit about the knitting in the Caucasus, if you don't mind.
Sure. The knitting in the Caucasus it's so much fun. So like socks so most of the things that I focused on are socks, because there is sort of an old style for making socks.
And sock knitting is awesome.
And sock knitting is awesome, especially in the Caucasus. I mean, sock knitting is awesome everywhere, but I really like sock knitting in the Caucasus. But they, like in North Africa, in Morocco, they knit their socks from the toe up. And they are highly decorated. So unlike the socks that I was working with in Morocco, which tend to be more on the plain side, there was some decorative elements happening every now and again, but for the most part, they were sort of solid colored. But the socks in the Caucasus and in Armenia are very highly decorated. A lot of the patterns that you see on the socks are similar to the patterns that you might see in their rug weaving and their embroidery as well. And some of these motifs you'll even see in like the wood carving. So, there's a lot of play with motifs and colors and those kinds of things.
And who is knitting socks in the Caucasus?
In the Caucasus, it is very much something that's done by women. I think in the past, women would make dowries, and those dowries would include different kinds of home items, sort of like a starter kit for getting your house started. And so they were responsible for weaving rugs to include in that dowry, as well as linens and tablecloths and clothing items, which of course included socks. And they started from a very young age, maybe around anywhere between like 5 and 8 or something like that. And they were expected to make many pairs of socks to include in their dowries. And this is because, from what I understand, these socks were used as gifts. They were also used by the family to wear during special occasions. And in some instances, there are some oral accounts, historical accounts of people also using socks as to trade in a barter economy, in a village kind of situation.
Are they spinning the yarn for this?
In the past, they did. There were a lot of spinners. I think there are lots and lots of historical photos of people spinning in Armenia. But today they are mostly using acrylic yarns that are purchased at local yarn stores. Every now and again, you'll find an older woman who knows how to spin, who will occasionally spin yarn to make her own socks. But it's not something that you see as frequently anymore.
So how did you set about finding the knitting in Armenia? You mentioned that in Morocco, you sort of came into this museum. It sounds almost like by accident. Did you set out on purpose to learn about knitting in Armenia?
I did. By the time I got to Armenia, I had published my book on knitting in Morocco, and I sort of decided, this is my calling. This is what I want to do. I want to keep working at this. And so I decided that I was going to continue with my research. Even when I was in Morocco, I sort of had this idea that there might be a connection between West Asia, specifically like Anatolia, the Caucasus, that area, and knitting in North Africa. It's not necessarily a new idea. It's not necessarily my own idea. Bell and Ricard, they bring this up in that pamphlet that I talked about earlier. They sort of hypothesized that maybe knitting was brought to Algeria in the Ottoman time period by the Turks, which is what they speculated, that maybe the Turkish people brought knitting to Algeria. And so that was kind of there. There's also a lot of really sort of interesting linguistic clues in some ways that I think would be interesting to look at. But I think the Turkish language, Arabic, Farsi, all of these languages, there are a lot of commonalities between them. And it's really, really difficult to say in which direction words went. That is definitely something that needs to be left to a linguist, which I am not. But I think that there's definitely potential for some interesting linguistic studies there that could maybe help shed some light on the relationship between knitting in West Asia and knitting in North Africa. But anyways, all of this to say that I went to Armenia sort of with this idea that there is probably some kind of a connection between these two knitting traditions. And if there is, what might it be? And so that's always kind of been in the back of my mind. But I showed up in Armenia and I was like, okay, I don't know anything about knitting in Armenia, so I need to learn about this tradition here. And so I set about trying to find knitters who could talk to me about the old style of knitting. And in Armenia, that was a little bit difficult because there are lots and lots of knitters in Armenia. Knitting is very popular. But I think I can venture to say that there is a difference, though, between sort of like popular knitting versus old style knitting. And that's the best way that I can think of to sort of like make this distinction. But there's sort of an old way of doing things and a new way of doing things. And it was this old way of doing things that I was really sort of interested in. And it was difficult to find women who still sort of made socks in the old style. Again, the people who sort of had these skills tended to be on the older side. But, yeah. And so I'm going to sound like a weirdo, but I would just sort of drive to small villages and I'd sort of, whenever I saw sort of a nice woman or someone to talk to, I would say, hey, do you know any knitters?
I love it.
And so I definitely got some funny looks sometimes. But in general, I think it was just such an oddball question. People were like, what? Well, actually, yeah, we do know somebody. And so people were just really so kind and they opened up their homes to me and they were excited to talk to me about their knitting skills and also about their ancestors and the people who came before them and who taught them how to do these things. I found that they were interested in talking about those kinds of things. So, yeah.
So if a lot of the knitters in Armenia are using acrylic yarn, does that mean that there isn't the same kind of sheep wool knitting connection there that you saw in Morocco?
That's a good question. So I think in the past, there was much more of a connection between the wool and knitting, but today you don't see that as much. But definitely the sheep raising has a very, very long history in Armenia. In fact, the domestication of sheep took place in kind of the vicinity of the Caucasus. It's not too far from the area where we think that sheep were probably first domesticated. So there's a very, very long history of working with wool. And I think up until sort of the industrialization of textiles, people were still producing, their own yarn for knitting by spinning with different types of spindles and spinning wheels as well in the Caucasus. But today you really don't see that as much. In Armenia, a lot of the shepherds are Yazidis, and they practice a type of seasonal pastoralism in which they live with their sheep in lower elevation villages in the wintertime. And then in the summertime, they go up to high elevation pastures called yaila. And in the past, when people were more reliant on handmade clothing, they would produce yarn to knit socks with it. And they also would process wool for other types of textile goods, like this traditional type of quilt that they make in the Caucasus. This is something that Armenians also do in Armenia. They also make these types of traditional woolen stuffed quilts, were very, very popular. But, I think in our modern day, it's very easy for people to just go to yarn store and buy industrially made yarn. And so that's what they do.
But are there still shepherds and are they still knitting?
Yes. So you will definitely see sheep throughout Armenia, and the shepherds, they move with those sheep up into the high pastures in the summertime. They'll go with their families, but there's not a lot of knitting happening per se because of the state of the wool industry and the low price of wool. The vast majority of that wool is just being burned. They're not doing anything with it. So one of the ways that I connected with knitters in Armenia was by reaching out to the official Armenian Gomper Club of America. And to give you some background, Gomper is a livestock guardian dog that is indigenous to the Caucasus. It's a livestock guardian dog that has been used in the Caucasus and by the Armenian people for thousands and thousands of years. There's examples of these dogs in artwork from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age even. We believe that's, they're even petroglyphs, rock art,
Oh, wow.
depicting these dogs. And so they have a very, very long history in the region, and they were bred specifically to guard sheep and other livestock from the numerous predators that they have in the Caucasus. There are bears there still today. They also have wolves. There is still a population of leopards that is beginning to come back. The population was very close to extinction, but they are coming back thanks to efforts by the World Wildlife Fund in Armenia. But anyways, long story short, I reached out to the official Armenian Gomper Club of America, which promotes the use of these dogs on farms and ranches in the United States in an effort to help preserve this breed and their special characteristics. And they are the ones who put me in touch with shepherds in Armenia. And through those shepherds, I was able to learn about this seasonal pastoral tradition of raising sheep there. And those shepherds then introduced me to their wives who had been knitters in the past, but don't necessarily knit so much anymore. Again, this is something that people did much more in the past, but, with changes in fashion and access to industrially made clothes, it's just not something people do very much anymore.
So it sounds like knitting in the High Atlas, in the village where you studied there, that was very much threatened. But it sounds like knitting in general in Armenia is not necessarily threatened, but this particular pocket is.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, I think knitting is something that people did out of necessity, even up until the 90s. In the 90s, there was just this sort of huge energy crisis, economic crisis in general. There was a period where there was not enough electricity and gas to heat homes. And so people were burning furniture to keep their homes warm in the wintertime. And they were having to make a lot of their own clothes. And so in this time period, it was very common to see women knitting socks to keep their families warm. And even my Armenian teacher, she said it, she was a kid during that time period, but she was like, yeah, I remember we had to make socks to keep our feet warm. It was just something you did. But I think the way that people have knit has kind of changed over time. Today, there's YouTube, and they definitely use it, and they learn different styles of knitting from YouTube. Also, it was really interesting. I met some knitters on the younger side. They were probably maybe in their 50s or 60s, and they lived in an area. I guess essentially what they did was they called it like the factory toe. And so what they were doing was when they were kids, they started getting these factory made socks, and they were checking out like, well, how is this toe made? Because this fits really nicely, kind of thing. And they just sort of created this new way of knitting a toe that is very different from what their grandmothers might have done. And so there was a lot of like innovation and playing around with ways to do things. So there were definitely a lot of like different ways of making toes and making heels. But despite that, I think it's safe to say that there was sort of an older way of doing things that was definitely considered, this is something different. This is something separate.
I did take a Armenian sock knitting class with you, and there were two things that blew my mind. There was a stitch wrapping technique that sort of reminded me of a weaving technique called sumac, but also kind of reminded me of sort of Estonian russitude, which is a wrapping technique. And then there was a grafting technique that didn't use a needle, and it blew my mind. I need to practice it so I don't forget.
Yes. Yeah, no. They use a lot of really interesting decorative techniques. And I think very much that this wrapping technique that you're talking about is influenced by weaving. The women who do the knitting, they're also weaving. They were rug weavers. And there are a variety of weaving styles in Armenia and in the Caucasus in general. But you have what's called a gork, which is a pile woven carpet. So that's the fluffy carpets with the pile on them. And then you have something called a carpet, which is where we actually get our English word carpet from. But that's more of the flat, like tapestry woven style carpet, which might be more familiar to some people with the word kilim, like a kilim style rug. But then there's also many other types of weaving that were used decoratively or were used to make sacks for carrying your belongings if you were traveling by donkey or camel or something like that. And they also used it for making salt sacks, the sacks that were used to carry salt along those trade routes. And a lot of them do use this type of weaving where it's mostly there's sort of just a simple flat weave, but then you wrap the warp threads to create the designs. And in Armenian, it's called zili, is one of the ways that they do this. So yeah, I think, in order to learn about knitting in Armenia, I really had to also dive into weaving and embroidery techniques as well. It's definitely important, I think, if you're going to understand the knitting tradition in that area. So, I do think that there was this influence from weaving on knitting in terms of like how they decorated things. And in terms of that wrapping technique that they have, it takes a long time to knit that way. It's going to slow you down a lot. And so if you have, this is my hypothesis, but I think if you had socks with a lot of that type of work on it, it would have increased the value of that sock because it just took so much more time to make it. It's so much more labor intensive.
So, and you're currently working on collecting the knowledge that you got of knitting in Armenia into a book as well.
Correct. Yes. So I lived in Armenia for 3 years and I worked with different knitters across the country to learn about their sock. We focused on sock knitting because I felt like that would be the most relevant, I think, to the earlier work that I was doing. And I also looked at knitting collections at museums in Armenia to kind of get a sense for, what were some of the older styles like, older techniques, those kinds of things. And I am working on and I've done a lot of research, a lot of reading. My research has taken me all the way back into the Bronze Age and before. And
oh, wow.
And so it's a very large project. And so I'm trying to wrangle all of that information now into what will hopefully be a fun book to read. But again, like for my book on Morocco, I hope that it will sort of be a combination of travel writing, ethnography, and then, history. And I hope that it will present, the full context in which this knitting tradition exists, but from my perspective as a non-Armenian who has come and had this opportunity to live in Armenia and to work with these knitters.
So it may be completely unfair to ask you this when you're right in the throes of that project, but do you have a sense of where this kind of study might take you next?
I do. I actually have an idea for my third book, but I'm not quite ready to put that one out there yet. But it is definitely going to be very much more history focused. I can say that.
So what's next for the Keepers of the Sheep and those shepherds and knitters you met in Morocco?
So one thing that I would really love to do is to turn the book into a documentary film. I'm limited in publishing in English because that's the language that I write in, but not everybody speaks English. Not everybody reads in English. And certainly the community that very generously shared this information with me, they do not necessarily speak or read in English. And so I would really like to make this information available to people from the High Atlas, to people in Morocco, And I think rather than trying to translate this book into Tashalhit or Arabic or French or any of these other languages, I actually think probably the best thing to do would be to turn it into a series of videos that present the information in the book. And I think this would accomplish several things. One, by doing it as a film, the knitters themselves would be able to speak to their audience in their language. So, like Hussein and Mua, they would be able to speak to other people in the High Atlas in Tashalhit. Also, as a film, it could be subtitled in other languages, which would make the information available to people in other places. And so my idea is kind of to have, like a series of how to knit videos that are taught by the knitters in the High Atlas, but then to also include chapters or segments on the knitting history research that I included in the book. And in this way, that would make, these items that are in museums that might be difficult for people to visit, it would make that information and those objects available to them. Although more and more people in the High Atlas have access to smartphones and more people have laptops and computers, sometimes it can still be difficult to use those things for certain members of the community. But, I think YouTube and other video platforms are very accessible to people all over. And I think that by presenting this information through film, it would make this information available to the community and, again, just to the wider world so that more people are aware of this really unique and very valuable knitting tradition.
It does seem great that the same paved road that has brought in mass-produced garments that are sort of chasing out knitting could also bring in people who could document it.
Yeah, no, it definitely, it connects the world and it brings all these it brings this larger knitting community together. It puts us all into contact with one another, like people from the American knitting community can interact with people in the Moroccan knitting community. And I think it's just a really great way to share, to learn about one another, and to gain a deeper insight and understanding to this craft that I think brings joy to so many people.
Yeah. So I'm guessing people can learn more about this on your website, which has a very intriguing name. Can you tell me about that?
Oh, 106 meters from the road? Yes. So my website was actually originally my blog, and I didn't want to get rid of all of that work for whatever reason. I think at the time I was still trying to figure out exactly who I was as a writer and what it was that I wanted to put out there. So I just decided, you know what, I already have this blog going. I'm just going to run with it because I started this off to sort of like explore my identity as a writer. And I was doing all of this. I was exploring my identity as a writer as I was living in Niamey, Niger. And in Niger, they don't have addresses like we have addresses in the United States. It's not like house number 1234 and then 1236 and then 1238 or whatever. It's not ordered like that. Instead, the house numbers are determined by the house's distance to the main road, like the largest road in the neighborhood. And so my house was 106 meters from the main road in my neighborhood. And so that's how the block got its name.
How interesting. So the whole block was named this?
No, just my house. I think the house next to me was house number 76. So yeah, so it was just my house was house number 106. The street that I lived on, as far as I know, did not have a name. I mean, it wasn't even paved, but yeah, the main road that I was living next to was called Malibero Boulevard. And so my house was just number 106 from Malibero Boulevard.
Wow. I was wondering if it was a reference to how far you have to go to learn about knitting.
That would be, yeah. That would probably make more sense.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
But it speaks to sort of thinking about a different way that people live in different areas. And yeah.
Definitely. And honestly, at that time, I was a knitter at that time, but I was living in Niger where I really couldn't wear knitted things as much. So I wasn't doing as much knitting while I was there. I was doing more sewing because they have beautiful, amazing cloth there that you can work with. But, knitting wasn't really my thing there. But living in Niger definitely influenced how I thought about trade in Africa, specifically in, between sub-Saharan or Saharan Africa and North Africa. And the things that I saw there and experienced there greatly shaped how I thought or how I think about connectivity on the African continent.
Well, thanks, Irene. I'll include a link to that website where people can also find your book in our show notes.
Okay.
So I will be looking forward to hearing what your next project is.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you for having me. It was fun speaking with you.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.